happy to introduce Professor Graeme Atherton to our colloquium today, who is the director of the Centre of Inequality and Levelling Up at the University of West London. He leads the National Education Opportunities Network, NEON, which is a UK professional organization for access and equity in higher education, at which over 100 universities participate. And he also founded the World Access to Higher Education Network. So we are very much looking forward to your talk on equitable access and success in higher education across the world. So let's welcome Professor Graeme Atherton.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm really honoured to come to these wonderful facilities and speak to you all about this really important work. And hopefully, as we'll see today, it's quite an appropriate day to be doing this presentation. As we'll see later on, it's International Day for Women in Science. If they didn't know that before we chose the date, but we pretend we did to make it feel like it's really appropriate. And that'll come up, I think, as one of the key themes in my presentation today. What I'm going to do in a moment is outline what I'm going to speak about, give you a background to myself as well and why I do this kind of work. And hopefully have a chance to have some discussion and debate later on, and hopefully see why this is such an important issue. It has been across the world throughout the history of higher education, but particularly now at this time, as we face some real challenges when it comes to extending opportunity to all of those who could benefit in society and also in higher education and universities. So what's today's lecture? Firstly, a bit about me and what I'm going to do. Then we're going to do a little bit of background, looking at inequalities in higher education across the world, and a bit about why these inequalities matter, particularly why they matter at the moment. Then we'll do a little bit of a look at higher education inequalities in science, technology, engineering, mathematical subjects. Those are the topics and the themes, of course, which I'm sure you are researching and undertaking your studies in. Then we'll talk a bit about the World Access to Higher Education Network, or WAHEN, which is the recent initiative which I've been lucky enough to take forward. And then some final thoughts at the end about where we go next, dealing with some of these questions, and hopefully that'll provoke some chance for discussion. But first, a bit of background to why I'm involved and have been throughout my career, I guess, in efforts to address inequalities and diversity in higher education. So this is where I come from. Now, this is a place in England called Blackpool. Has anybody heard of Blackpool? A friend over here, why have you heard of Blackpool, my friend? They're a football team, a small football team. Now, this in Blackpool is a seaside resort. When Blackpool was kind of founded as a resort around 120 years ago, they decided to have a tower, a bit like the Eiffel Tower, only shorter. So this is where people go in the UK for a holiday, or traditionally did go to the UK for a holiday, because I'm sure it may be the same, I guess, in Germany. As we got into the latter part of the 20th century, we started to get better international travel. People started to realise that going for a week in Blackpool, where, as you probably know in the UK, where it was a little bit unpredictable, you could go to Spain for a week for the same price. Less people go to Blackpool. And now Blackpool looks a little bit like this. Blackpool is one of the poorest places in the UK, and this is one of the poorest estates in Blackpool. And if you look around the back of here, that is where I grew up in the 1980s. And I came from a council estate in Blackpool, one of the poorest parts of the UK, where nobody went to university, when my parents left school when they were 14 years old. And I was lucky enough to be good at school and got an opportunity to go to university. And I went to this place. And you might have heard of Blackpool. I guess everybody's heard of Oxford University. This is Trinity College, Oxford. And this is the college that I studied as an undergraduate. So my journey from that council estate to this was a long journey. And I was lucky enough to make that journey. But I realized that I was one of the very few lucky ones who can make a journey like that. But the vast majority of people from that estate, none of them went to university, never mind going to university that looked as pretty as this one. And that kind of understanding of that inequality was what then shaped my career afterwards. And since I left my PhD in the late 1990s, I spent the rest of my career researching, leading, founding, taking initiatives forward to address inequalities in higher education, just like the ones I was lucky enough to overcome, but everybody in my class, in my school, in my state, unfortunately, were not. Okay, so the organisation I founded, particularly in the UK 12 years ago, was called NEON, a National Education Opportunities Network, working to widen access to higher education in the UK. In the UK, we have a very well-developed higher education system compared to many other countries in the world. We have these prestigious universities like Oxford and many others you'll have heard of. Yet at the same time, we have, as many other countries as I'll show, deep inequalities in who goes on to higher education from particular backgrounds. NEON is an organisation that tries to support universities to become more equitable. What do we mean by equity? First to point this out, because when we're talking about equity, we're not talking just about the numbers of students who go on to higher education. We're talking about the backgrounds of those students. We're talking about those students who come from minorities, or in some cases across the world, disadvantaged majority populations, often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnic groups, experiencing disabilities. How we shape and how we see inequality differs across different countries. Differs in Germany, South Africa, to UK, to Indonesia, etc., etc. What is NEON? As I said before, NEON is an organisation with over 100 universities represented, and 80% of students in higher education in England are from NEON members. So we bring the community of universities together in England to try and support their work to become more equitable. It's worth pointing out that despite the work we do, the poorest students make up less than 10% of home students, i.e. not international students in England. So there's huge inequalities in the English higher education system. However, we're not alone in that regard. Let's look at a global picture when it comes to who goes on to higher education. Firstly, we frame that in terms of what UNESCO thinks should be the case. UNESCO has a number of what's described as Sustainable Development Goals, which you may have heard of. UNESCO's effort to address sustainability across the world. Sustainable Development Goal 4.3, outlined there by 2030, equal access for all men and women to affordable, quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including university. We are a far distance away from that goal, as we'll show in a moment. Despite that, it's worth thinking about what UNESCO thinks should happen. So there's an awareness across the world of these inequalities in access to higher education. Just first, before we go on to look at the inequalities, we're thinking about higher education in numbers and setting the context of some of these things. This graph here shows you the growth in enrollments in higher education over the past 20 years, projected up to 2040. We'll try and get this thing to, so this is the, yes, so put the dot to work now. I'm not sure I'm doing with the dot, I just thought I could use it. So if we see over here, on this side of the graph, you see where the growth is going to be up to 2040 in students. We look at the global picture. But the growth in students will be in the global south. But despite the fact the growth in the global south, there's a level of growth to an extent across all parts and regions of the world. So we are going to see, hopefully, a growth in student numbers up to 2040 across the world. The question is, who are those students going to be? Who will get access to higher education as we move forward from 2025, where we see we're here, up to 2040? And at a moment, yes, my friend. Generally, higher education is after, it's seen as after bachelor's study or postgraduate education. Not usually TVET study. We're not talking about technical and vocational education. We're only talking about higher education study. So it's after the RVTR in this country, but it differs in different countries as well, because different countries have different forms of post-secondary leaving qualifications. But higher education, generally, UNESCO defines it, higher education, as anything, we have to include a definition, anything above what they describe as level 4 study, after generally from the RVTR. This study I undertook around 7 or 8 years ago, looked at who goes to higher education across the world, called Charting Equity in Higher Education. So we see the numbers of students increasing, but I was concerned to find out in this study was what data do we have on who goes to higher education? The data here is a little bit patchy. Not all countries collect significant data on who goes to higher education by all forms of background. Not all countries collect data on who goes to higher education by socioeconomic background, by ethnic background. We did look at what we could find in terms of some form of socioeconomic background, gender, or ethnic background. What we found was that across the world, and we'll show this in a moment, in all the countries where we found data, that's 90% of countries across the world, we found there are differences in who goes to higher education by some form of background characteristic, be that socioeconomic background or be that gender. In very few parts of the world, there was no data. Our argument is that we think about higher education across the world. We think about what higher education does. It provides knowledge. It creates innovation, provides opportunity, but it's also unequal. In 90% of the countries of the world, all where we can find data, inequality in access exists by student background characteristics. So inequality, it differs in its extent across different countries. In the global south, inequalities in countries are more profound than they are in the global north, in Western, more developed and richer countries. However, at the same time, these inequalities exist across all different forms of countries. This other piece of work wasn't done by ourselves in our unit, but was taken from another piece of work undertaken by UNESCO. This is a survey of this is a collation of 122 country surveys across the world. So different individual surveys from 122 countries. It looks at wealth quintiles. The wealth quintile 1 is the lowest wealth quintile. Wealth quintile 5 is the highest wealth quintile. The reason that I like this particular graph is where we do have some data on attendance. We have less good data overall on completion, but this graph does show some data on completion. Because one of the challenges where it's not just who goes to higher education, who completes higher education. So, for instance, South Africa is probably a most extreme example here. They have a lot of competition to enter higher education. A lot of black students enter higher education. But only half of students from black backgrounds complete higher education in South Africa. A lot of students drop out. If you enter higher education but don't complete, you may develop debt. You may develop fees debt as well if there's a cost of higher education in your country. So what we show here is what's interesting here is that we see, particularly wealth quintile 1, 80% of students entering, but only 10% completing. You see over here, okay, slightly different situation. So I think it's important to emphasize, we talk about access. It's one thing entering higher education. You have to complete and finish your degree as well. Continue. That is an interesting question related to the surveys. Not one I can particularly answer very well because I didn't do the piece of research. However, I think it's connected to the fact that, I don't know what's connected to the fact, I think it's connected to the fact that some of the students aren't counted in the first surveys, are counted in the second surveys. I'm not 100% sure because I didn't do the survey myself. But the general point is that what we see at the bottom is that students dropping out and completing at the end. The picture's the same. I think the problem with this game is from the surveys is that when we're trying to gather data in this area, it is an imperfect exercise because often these are part of broader surveys looking at inequality and conditions within a country. Comparing countries is difficult because how you measure social background is difficult across different countries. But if you look into it in detail, the picture is that those from poorer backgrounds not only just fail to enter, also fail to complete. However, there are some progress. I mean, I think what that survey did show, the research did show, is that some of these inequalities have declined over the past 2 decades. There has been some improvements, despite the fact these inequalities still exist. There has been some improvements, particularly amongst some of the countries in the global south. Okay. Now let's turn our attention not just to the data we have on who participates and completes in higher education, but on policies. This piece of research was undertaken by our colleagues in the Europe Foundation in the US, by our colleague Jamil Salmi, around 7 or 8 years ago. What he tried to do was find as much as he could about higher education equity policies across the world. What Jamil found was that in his global survey of 110 countries, as in 20% of the countries have a higher education equity strategy. Less than a third have equity participation, or success targets. We did find that in most countries, higher education strategies did talk about equity. It was mentioned. It was seen as an issue. Yet it wasn't seen as a priority issue, and weren't separate strategies in that area. And even less countries, there was actually success targets. So there's a long way to go, I think, in making inequalities in higher education access and participation and completion a priority for governments. That's one of the things that we focus a lot in our work. It's a political question. How do we get countries to focus on these inequalities in higher education participation? And the final part of this section, we'll just look a little bit at the European question, given we're doing this presentation here in Germany. In Europe, through the Bologna process, those who've heard of the Bologna process, the Bologna process was launched in 1999. It's part of a broad initiative to try and get European higher education systems to harmonise and work closer together. And the Bologna process transcends that international mobility for students. It transcends research and research funding, as well as what I describe as a social dimension. Social dimension being very similar to what I described earlier on, equitable access and success in higher education, but it's in diversity of populations. This graph here shows you a little map of Europe, and it shows you where we have countries with top-level strategies addressing the social dimension, top-level strategies addressing the social dimension of the students, the staff, and no strategy. So a variable picture across the region. So again, Europe actually, compared to other regions of the world, has put in more of a commitment by policymakers. And this graph shows some variability. So certain middle parts, there's less no strategy. There are strategies. And one of the points about strategy that comes through from the other work that's been done in Europe is it's okay having a strategy for policymakers, the other thing, implementing that strategy. Governments have a lot of strategies about things. They don't always implement them and reach impact and make differences. So while it actually is quite a lot of dialogue around the social dimension in Europe, a lot of governments have recognised the issue of inequalities in higher education. Not all countries are actually acting upon those inequalities and taking those strategies forward. At the same time, there's some encouraging pictures, a little like in Europe, compared possibly to other parts of the world. Okay, so thus far, we talked a bit about why I got into this work. We've looked a bit about the picture across the world. We can see that inequalities in higher education are pervasive across the world, and policy commitment is very variable across the world. Let's think a little bit, though, why these inequalities matter, particularly at this time. Sure. To an extent, those countries that have challenges with their secondary education systems in the global south clearly have problems also in terms of who accesses their higher education systems. Yet at the same time, countries where there are relatively well-developed secondary education systems still have inequalities in who accesses higher education. So, for instance, if we won't look to comparatively, one would argue that the German and UK educational systems are robustly financed compared to many across the world. Yet at the same time, there's inequalities in higher education participation in those countries. Yeah, for sure. Yes, the extent of inequality, like inequalities generally, are higher in many of the global south countries, whereas as you pointed out, secondary systems are less developed. Many children don't finish school or finish schooling in poorly resourced schools as well. But one can always correlate. It doesn't mean that, in fact, if you've got a well-developed schooling system, you'll start equality in our education system. Why do inequalities matter now? Now, this is a different graph, moving away from higher education for a moment. This is a graph showing the growth of hard right policies and hard right governments in the European Union. It shows over here that this is about a year or so old. There were 7 countries in the European Union where there was hard right political parties in government in those countries. Now, that sets a context a little bit for some of the work that we try to do. It's always been challenging, I guess, to place issues around inequality and equality on the political agenda across different countries. It's coming at a moment profoundly challenging for some of the work that we're doing. This gives you a context of some of the growth of the hard right in the EU, which I'm sure you know about already. Nobody's not aware of the political changes that we see in a moment across Europe, across other parts of the world. But we see growth in particular different perspectives on what countries should be like, who should govern, what equality should look like, etc. We're now seeing, of course, very much in the US, the election of a new president, a particular confrontation of diversity initiatives. This headline shows Trump policies crackdown on diversity initiatives. You're not aware what we've seen in the US in the last few weeks is a concerted resistance and defunding of many initiatives related to diversity, education, equality, and inclusion, including those in higher education. We're going to speak in a moment about International Women's Day in Science. But I was on a call with a colleague from the US only yesterday evening when I got here to Germany. She was telling me that some of her colleagues' initiatives on International Women's Day in Science have been defunded already by the federal government. This is a pushback on diversity, and inclusion and inequality-related policies. So I guess for this work addressing inequalities in higher education that we're engaged in, it's a critical and urgent time, as we've seen even the small progress that my organisation and others have made across the world potentially being challenged by political developments, if you like. It's the final example here, the example from the US, bringing it a little closer to Germany. This is a report from a piece of research undertaken only last year in the Netherlands, very specifically with diversity employees in higher education. What this article goes on to talk about is the problems that many staff working on diversity in universities in the Netherlands are facing, actually individual problems, as they've actually faced particularly reactions and harassment for the work they're trying to do around anti-racism, decolonized education, and gender identity. So it's very much at the forefront of what they're trying to do in the Netherlands. Some staff are really facing day-to-day difficulties in their jobs. So it's very much in a moment we're seeing a lot of contested issues regarding whether this is an area of work that should be prioritized, if the investment should be put in it, indeed if it's the appropriate thing to do. So for those who believe it is the appropriate thing to do, who believe in it strongly like myself and the work that my colleagues do, it's a particularly urgent time for developing this work at the moment. We can go on to that and we can do a separate presentation on all that. But I just wanted to point to very much to position this work very much in what's happening very much now at the moment. Okay. Let's turn our attention now then to particularly the field which you colleagues are engaged in terms of the sciences. Particularly, as I say today, very appropriate to doing this work today, because today is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. It's the 10th anniversary of the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. UNESCO declared a commemoration day focusing on these issues of inequality, also looking at initiatives to address these inequalities. We talked a lot about socioeconomic background inequalities so far, but gender, of course, is also a particular issue when it comes to sciences. This is a graph here showing us a little bit about the proportion of women scientists and engineers across different European countries. We see the average of women scientists and engineers in 2019 is around 41%. We see here, I think Germany is somewhere around here. So it's a little bit around I guess that's around there. It's a little bit less than that. But what's kind of interesting about some of these, we can look at all the different graphs. What I find really interesting about this broader picture as well is that if you look at the UNESCO briefings, apparently it's the case that the proportion of women scientists and engineers isn't necessarily related to the wealth of the country or even the strengthness of the education system, quite interestingly. In some regions of the world where, generally speaking, education systems are a little less robustly financed and developed, as have a higher proportion of women scientists and engineers, in parts of the world where education systems are perhaps better funded, robustly supported. Lots of interesting dynamics going on here when it comes to the proportion of women scientists and engineers. What's very interesting about some of the other data we're aware of here is the percentage of women in postgraduate physics areas globally is only around 20%. And in new AI fields, the proportion of women only is around 22 to 25% globally. Again, some of the data here, I think, probably needs developing with all these surveys. But it does indicate that there are so many dynamics here with regards to the participation of women in science and engineering, particularly the fact that it's not always related. But one would possibly, again, we talked before about the relationship between a broader country and its education system and its level of wealth. But it always translate to participation and inequality when it comes to participation of women in science and engineering, which I find quite interesting. Interested in looking at this further, this is a report only released recently, published just earlier this year, highlighting the need for more research in this field. Again, I think probably, I found another interesting conclusion from this, that there is quite a significant amount of collaborative research in Europe, for instance, in the fields of science, technology, and engineering. I'm sure that many of you have collaborative relationships, your departments do, with colleagues from Europe and across the world. One of the conclusions of this report, released again by UNESCO, was that there's need for more collaboration in terms of STEM education research to understand some of these issues a little bit better. Some of the data is okay, we understand a little more about why are these differences in existence, the extent of them across subject areas, their variability across different countries. Some of the recommended actions here from UNESCO in terms of addressing some of these issues of gender equality in the sciences are providing funding for outreach activities featuring female scientists, discoveries and stories from female scientists, images in school textbooks. Again, very interesting, like many of these challenges, a lot of these issues start at very early ages. There are questions here about the role of higher education in this. Nobody would say that higher education, in the sense when it comes to inequalities overall in participation and success, when it comes to reflecting inequalities in science and engineering and research fields, does obviously to a large extent reflect society. We'll speak later on of the contribution universities can make. It's very important to think here about starting very early. I think one of the messages coming through this. Looking at some of the recommendations there, you'll see particularly the top recommendations. You can think about, this is a broader issue of perception. Some of the work we've done with school children in the UK shows that their perceptions about which men or women or roles they should do are formed at primary school level, elementary school level. By the age 10 or 11, young children have perceptions about what women should do, what men should do. Also, what's quite interestingly the case in terms of progression as well, though, is that the data also shows that in terms of achievement levels for girls and boys in school, in quite a lot of countries across the world, particularly some of the richer countries, girls are actually doing better than boys at school on average, achieving better grades, actually included in some of the sciences. Yet they're not taking science options when they go on post-schooling. They're going into humanities-based options. It's not just a case of look at perceptions when children are primary school. Think about why are young people taking routes, or girls particularly, not into the sciences, when many of them actually have strong science-based qualifications at school. Then going to other routes. So it's very interesting points throughout the system to think about here, particularly on this particular commemoration day for UNESCO. I'm sure many things are happening, I imagine, across the world, focusing intently on this issue of women and girls in science. Okay, a final report for us here. I think that is actually the full report that I mentioned earlier on. So you can see that report there. I'm going the wrong direction now. Backwards. Yes. So there again, just some key findings from this last report. Issues of STEM education research. A lot of it originates from the USA, which is a challenge as well.
And tidak itu, oops.
I guess your question of whether it's proved there's a push into that. I mean, that's an issue of whether you believe there should be equality, I suppose, within particular science areas. As to whether women could have their potential to succeed in areas of science and not achieving that potential, I might argue they could do. Depends what sort of proof you would like to see, I guess. I mean, maybe that's a question for discussion later on.
Why question why Bologna who
Well, it depends on what level of proof you want to take. I mean, I guess if you looked at those women who've got into other areas of work and spoke to them afterwards, would they prefer to go into sciences? And some research suggests that some women would have preferred to go into science if they believe the options available to them, because at the time they believed they're able to do that kind of work. There is some research that indicated that. It's not always the case that people make choices because they're the choices that they want to do at the time. They're the choices they feel they have to make. So that's been some research that's shown that is the case. But the extent of it, as pointed out there, it needs to be expanded and developed, because most STEM education research originates from the US and not always from other parts of the world. Particularly, though, when it comes to perceptions of science roles, certainly it's the case that we've done extensive research that shows that primary school pupils do have perceptions of gender that are different, and gender roles that are different. Whether that then shapes their choices, it does. Whether those choices have been different, well, choices are always perceptions shaped by your experiences. To an extent, your experiences do shape your choices. Building community awareness and support for STEM. Also, research shows that almost 50% of students with disadvantaged backgrounds in the EU underachieve in mathematics. So we focused a lot in the STEM area on gender differences. We also have to consider, I guess, issues of disadvantage. And we know that certain disadvantaged young people do worse in school than others because they underachieve in mathematics. And again, there's some research to show that. Overall, though, I think, again, student access to effective STEM research and leaders, reducing STEM talent and skill gaps as well. Okay, let's move on now to the final part of the presentation in terms of, we've talked a little bit about the differences in higher education participation across the world by social background. We looked at policy differences across the world. We've considered some of the contemporary challenges to diversity, inclusion, and inequalities work, as well as some of the conditions and situations in the science field on this particular special day. I want to talk a bit about the work we're doing internationally to bring organisations together to collaborate in the area of access to higher education. Why we're doing this. Again, our new initiative, launched only in December, is the World Access to Higher Education Network, or WAHEN. Because our view is that thinking about higher education, there is extensive international collaboration in higher education across different subject areas. The value of international collaboration is the exchange of practice, the exchange of ideas, the formation of alliances and advocacy, and allowing opportunities for students, researchers, and others to develop their work. That doesn't exist in the space of equity and diversity in higher education. There is the opportunity to bring people together across the world who are engaged in this area of work, to allow them to exchange and collaborate and understand the challenges in their own countries so they can be affected and supported to do things in their own particular environment. So WAHEN has been set up to do. The reason we've done that is because, again, go back to the presentation, we would argue, while this challenge of inequality is different in different countries, it's also a global challenge. Therefore, as a global challenge, it suggests a need for global action. Some of our partners involved in this work outlined on the slide there. So we're working with the World Bank, with UNESCO, several charitable foundations, with the European Commission to take forward this area of work. WAHEN, we've launched in December 24 and led by our network in the UK, is the first global network focused on access and success in higher education. Again, we see as a global challenge is international collaboration to move forward. Again, the challenges are, again, within higher education and without higher education as well. Those in this room have been lucky enough to participate and the benefits and reap the benefits individually and collectively of the higher education experience. As we argued earlier on, thousands of adults in different communities have not had that opportunity and never invited to do so as well, by virtue of the background in which they come from. We argued that that is both inefficient and inequitable. And therefore, the network will try and advocate and push forward to change and affect that across individual countries, regions, and collaborative across the world. What we will do in WAHEN, what we are doing, is capacity building, enabling those who have an interest in equity and access and diversity work to exchange practice, work together. Research and advocacy. Again, we're planning to do an updated work on our access map we indicated earlier on in the presentation. The data has improved since 2017 when we did our last assessment of the situation across the world when it comes to differences in higher education participation. We intend to do another piece of work, bringing that research together, hopefully this year. World Access to Higher Education Day, for 5 years, from 2018 to 2022, we initiated World Access to Higher Education Day. It was one day where we invited organisations across the world to focus at least some of their energies on inequalities in access and success in higher education. We're taking seminars, discussion sessions, and other activities with young people across the world. And convening as well, bringing leaders and institutions together to look at strategies and approaches in their own organisations, think about how they can address inequalities, promote diversity and opportunity for all communities. This is just a snip from our website. Particularly important to us is the activities people are undertaking. So we have now 50 different activities in countries across the world showing the kind of initiatives undertaking different subject areas to try and promote and take forward equality, opportunity within their institutions and subject areas. So examples, actually, these 3 initiatives are all from South Africa. You go down the equity, or we've gone down the page on the website, you see many different examples from across the world. But again, so we can see applicability at different contexts. Universities are different, contexts are different across the world. We need different examples of what is being successful, what is making a difference, what is helping those to access and succeed from all backgrounds in higher education for Equitable. Those are our final thoughts then, as I come to a conclusion today. I'll offer 3 final thoughts. Undoubtedly, inequalities and access and success in higher education are deep-rooted and societal. They're not initiated entirely or solely, you might argue, by universities. But they are part of the responsibility of universities to address. Very interested in that context about the responsibility of universities in that area. We go back to the present political context. We look to the US, where most of the big news is coming from at the moment with a new government. I'm interested to think about the thoughts, not just of Donald Trump, but his vice president, J.D. Vance, who has wrote quite a bit about the role of universities in the US context, arguing that while they contribute a great deal to knowledge, innovation, and research, are disconnected from their local communities, contribute not enough to their own local environments, and only support a certain part of their local populations. He's advocating taxing those universities that don't contribute more to their local areas. I wouldn't go as far to do that. And most of Vance's opinions I definitely don't agree with. But I do think that some of these challenges about the responsibility of university in society today are interesting ones. I think we should discuss what is the responsibility of a university to its local regions or its communities. Universities are often tremendously well funded in comparison to other public services. That funding brings a level of responsibility. And what is that responsibility? We're discussing and thinking about that. Secondly, inequality fueled political divides and hamper scientific progress. The inequalities that we discussed today are fueling some of the divisions within Western and other societies. We have to think seriously about how we address those inequalities. No coincidence in my own country, for instance, that when we speak about, many of you will know, of course, you all know that we voted to exit the European Union 7 or 8 years ago. In Brexit, we described it in the UK. We look at the areas that voted for Brexit. They were the areas that were the lower income areas that had the least opportunities, and the least people going to higher education. The areas at the forefront of inequality And the Brexit vote was an expression of their discontent around their lives as much as anything else. Finally, international collaboration is vital, support and enable what's happening within individual countries. Addressing these inequalities at universities is very difficult and very challenging. Universities, as I said at the top of the final point, is only one part of the equation. School systems, political decisions, economic structures, they transcend and overlap all these challenges. If universities do want to make a difference, how to do that? It's important to collaborate and share practice and share ideas to make a difference if universities want to do that. That's why international collaboration, we believe, is so important in this space, particularly now, as we're seeing challenges to the goal of offering opportunities to enter higher education from everybody across the world, whatever background they come from. Thank you.
Okay, hi. So are there questions from the audience? Yeah, I guess. So maybe like a bit controversial question could be because universities cannot accept everybody who wants to attend the university, increasing access and equality in access might also require being more selective, so preventing other people from access this higher education. Like when you want to make people more equal, that means that people that have been benefiting from a system suddenly have disadvantages. Would this also be an issue in this topic?
Well, I guess first part of your question, how many students universities can admit is also a structural issue for a system. The system wants to expand, or governments want universities to expand. They have to make decisions regarding the amount of places available. It's difficult, for the second part of your question, to address inequality without expanding access overall. Primarily because there are groups in society for whom they believe that their children should go to higher education and other options aren't the options their children should be pursuing, i.e. non-university options. We're not at a point where, in many systems, where there are a change in that opinion. So therefore, if you are going to expand and address inequality, you have to think about how you expand access as well. And that's a systemic and a policy challenge, how you expand access. But you could do so. Because the other challenge, of course, is what universities believe students need to enter. Universities often take a kind of narrow view about what students need to enter and the qualities they have. And that's often a discussion. What qualities and skills do students need? What entry requirements should there be? How strict should those entry requirements be? There's a set of questions around those things that need to be addressed and thought about. And some universities that want to admit students and broader sets of backgrounds have thought hard about how you both ensure students are able to cope with the studies when they enter, but also recognizing the fact it's an even race. You get two students who present to you with a set of qualifications. One student comes from a background where their parents have gone to higher education, they go to a well-resourced school, often a paid-for school, receiving extra tuition, paid for. One student doesn't, and they get the grades. Do those grades reflect the equal ability of those students or not? And these are tough questions, and they're not questions you can answer in 2 minutes. But they're the questions that need to be confronted and discussed and dealt with by universities as well if they're going to actually affect some of these issues. And again, that's why I think international collaboration discussion is important, because there's some universities really got into addressing that. They've always wanted to do that. It's not an easy process. It takes time. It takes changing cultures. There are many in the system who it's difficult for them to think about those issues. They've grown up in a system as academics that looks very different to that. One of the big challenges we have is academic staff. What the system could look like now, what it looked like when they were coming up as academics, looks very different. And the cultural dissonance with that is something that also has to be discussed and talked about. We've had that at our own institution. Long answer. Well, big question on that.
I'm just curious, you gave this example of your own journey. How did you overcome the inequality you were presented with? How were you able to go to Trinity College?
I guess I was lucky that I was quite good at school. So I was always good at school. And again, there's a natural talent thing. You know, I mean, it was just, yeah, to some of my contemporaries, it seems to be easier for me to do that than others. At the same time as a lot of people were better at football than I was. Because they could run quicker than I could, that kind of thing. And then, you know, I worked hard, and then I was lucky enough to get some good advice from my particular school, particularly in the latter parts of secondary school, and they gave me advice. But I never set out to go to Oxford. I was offered extra tuition if I applied, because my school wanted people to go to Oxford because it's a prestigious thing in the UK. And if you put it on your prospectus for your school, more people will choose to go to your school. So I was offered extra tuition, and then I applied. And then possibly because I think, on reflection, I wasn't that bothered. When I had to do an interview and a separate exam, I tried my best, but I didn't feel the pressure because it wasn't as you think to me. So I think it was advantageous to me. And I have a daughter who's 15, and I see how well she wants to do at school, and how she goes to a school where a lot of people want to do very well. There's a lot of pressure on you people to do well now. And I think in some ways that's a kind of hindrance. I think I benefit from lack of pressure for a start. Because my parents didn't know what it was about. They never said, go. They were like, well, that sounds interesting. But I guess a disadvantage, not mean that advice, but an disadvantage, because inadvertently, you pressure your kids to do things the way, you know, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think it was challenging. I was lucky, and I think I got some good support, and the lack of pressure as well probably helped.
Yes, I'll try to phrase my question. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I guess my question is, what is sort of the ultimate end goal, right? So like in the long run, is the ideal that your choice of education is basically independent from your background? Or is it, somehow that there's some ideal proportion to how what your upbringing was, and how do you, because to some extent it's natural to be influenced by what your parents did, and how do you gauge how far you are from where you want to be?
These are good questions. I mean, I guess there's 2 or 3 points in there. I guess you want to take them individually. I guess in terms of an end goal, I mean, you have to recognize that the sort of inequalities like we're discussing, as I mentioned a moment ago, are almost endemic to the kind of economic system that we have in the world. You know, that you do have capitalist economic systems, and there will be inequalities. So, to achieve that kind of goal of most perfect equality across groups in terms of access to education is probably something that be difficult or impossible to obtain, not in my lifetime. I think certainly the goal is to, and also in terms of what those goals look like, I think they look different in different contexts around different countries. There are kind of a lot of intermediate goals that countries will think about for immediate problems they have. I took the South African example. Their intermediate problem is just reducing to some significant degree the numbers of students who drop out, because that's just a bad thing. They're developing debt. They get halfway through a course, they get all the debt and no qualification at the end. So some definite, definitive goals there. And that differs across countries. We've talked a lot, for instance, about particular generic inequalities, for instance, in socioeconomic background. Some countries have particular ethnic groups where participation rates are ridiculously low. They're down at 5 to 10% of a grouping, whereas the average is 50 to 60%. So there's an intermediate goal to raise some of that, and the idea that there must be opportunities available to some of those young people to do better. The other point, though, is quite an interesting point about choices, because I think also a lot of the work that my university is trying to do, in collaboration with schools and others, is give people opportunities and choices. It's not the case that all groups would want to go to higher education, or even should if they want to. But the opportunity to make choices is limited. I think that was the point earlier on, is that you don't have a free choice at that when you're young. You are shaped by what's around you. And if you don't have those opportunities of skill and et cetera to make those choices that are right for you, be it a university or not, and that's a difficult question. You have to form intermediate goals. That's why strategies are needed as well to work through some of these things, because they're difficult questions. And they have to be ones that are consensual as well, to be honest. I mean, I could sit here and say the end goal is X, but I'm not even sure I would say that. I think what we're trying to do as well is encourage there to be that engagement in the issue at national level, to have consensual discussions about what the goals should be that works for that particular context. And it wouldn't be the same everywhere. And perhaps it shouldn't be. But there's a lot of progress made in those areas as well. So I think that's an answer, but yeah, it's a good question.
So in my home country, there has also been a lot of political effort to push for higher studies, and the consequence on this is that, let's say, not higher studies like being a plumber or whatever have become less and less popular, and also are less good viewed, let's say, socially speaking, even though, at least from my point of view, they are at least as useful to society and, let's say, people from higher studies. So how would you balance pushing higher studies to grant equal chances to everyone by keeping interesting, let's say, not higher studies, which are also mandatory and extremely equal? How do you promote higher studies without downgrading all the others?
Well, I think that's an important question. I think by doing that, remembering that what you should be doing is working in partnership with schools, with colleges, with the career system as well, within a country, to ensure that all young people receive advice and support to take progression routes they want to do. I think as well, I think that what you will also see is that some of the qualification areas that don't necessarily lead to academic university degrees still often need higher levels of skill than they did before. So encouraging those working in, think about take jobs such as plumbing and electrician, they actually need more qualifications in that space than they did 20 years ago, because that industry field has moved on. So we work with colleagues in the vocational and TBET space. They need encouragement and support as well. But it's important, again, it's where you need to get balance, in a policy sense. We think it's legitimate to encourage and support. And again, pushing is important work, because pushing implies that you are telling somebody they should do something. None of my universities that we work with tell young people that they have to do this. We try and provide them with the tools to make the best decisions they want to do. Now, clearly, in our view, there is lots of potential amongst the groups of young people who don't progress higher education to do so. And the evidence bears that out in the beginning. We spoke to them later in their lives. But certainly, it's extremely important that all areas of progression, be vocational, academic, or non-university bearing, are seen as legitimate and prioritised. And to an extent, there is an argument that the big accent on higher education has moved you away from that. Partly some of those problems, by the way, go back to the school system. Partly in experiences in the UK and other countries we've looked at. It's partly because the advice and support they receive within schools often veers away from vocational options. And again, there's a lot of work to be done around that as well. So I think it is about how you have a kind of system that supports particularly young people to make future decisions, that looks at all kind of opportunities available to them. That requires universities working often in partnership with other agencies. And that does happen in some instances, doesn't happen in others.
Question. Yeah. So I was very impressed by this graphic where with the number of students growing that much. I mean, where will all these students go for studying? Because universities cannot build up that fast, right? Or also the next part of the question is also how, will it be more difficult to actually get access to universities because there are now more competitors, so to say, for one spot?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, if you look at that graph, again, these predictions, but a lot of the growth is predicted to happen in the global south, so particularly in Africa and parts of Asia as well. And there are huge challenges there. I don't know how true it is, but there was somebody said a few years ago that actually you need to build a university every day in Africa to meet the demand for education. You can't do that. And they're really grappling with those questions. How to expand systems when you don't have the resources to do so. And you have to be very careful about that, because you can end up with all sorts of potential suboptimal outcomes. For instance, one particular move forward is to have greater hybrid or online learning, which is good, flexible, offers opportunities, can be micro-credentials. I know it's something we spoke about, offering different kinds of chunks of learning. However, of course, the problem is you get two-tier systems. Better provision for those who attend physically, less good provision for those who don't. That's a challenge as well. Quality is a huge issue, in capacity as well. I mean, one of the big issues in the global south in higher education is quality, because there's providers moving into the private sector providers who come into the space, the opportunities to make money by charging fees to students, but not offering the kind of quality provision that is there. I mean, if you think about some parts of the world, like the Wild West for higher education, basically, you just people turning up, opening this, closing that, offering these kind of provisions without good systems and regulation. That's another challenge. There's also an issue about the role of European and other well-developed systems in this. So, for instance, I'll take the example of UK in universities. Apparently, in 3 or 4 years' time, there'll be more students studying outside the UK for UK degrees than studying for UK degrees within the UK through transnational education arrangements, where universities have partnership arrangements accrediting universities or providers outside of the UK, setting campuses up, arrangements out. And if you look at my own university, you look at the pattern, there's no strategy to this, by the way. It's just where you can make money and make relationships. Now, that's in the UK, because the UK education system is under great financial pressure for some of the set of questions. But it's an interesting point that where's the role for those countries that have got great historical developed systems and quality assurance and other forms of mechanisms in terms of working with other parts where there will be growth for students, or there wants to be growth for students. Look, that's the South African challenge. I mean, there's another slide that I show sometimes, I could have showed you, and it's from about a newspaper article about 2012, and it's from the admission day at University of Johannesburg. And the competition to get in university was so much, it's seen as, even though many people drop out, South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And the opportunities it provides if you can get into university and stick it through does give you opportunities that it doesn't have for others. So the clamour to get in was so much that 3 people were killed outside trying to climb over the walls to get across. They heard there was some places opened up. So that gives you just a kind of snapshot of the kind of tension. If you go out to, for instance, I went out to India a few years ago, and I got a tuk-tuk driver. The tuk-tuk driver was telling me how he's saving his money up to get his daughter to go to university, because that's the way to progress. So, but there's no easy answers to that. So there's targets set, and particularly by certain countries have set aspirational targets to expand higher education, India being an example, doubling participation by 2035. But how are they going to get there? They don't really know. So there's a lot of questions about what provision will look like in those parts of the world, and what higher education will look like in those parts of the world, that I don't think have been probably answered.
So is there one last urgent question? So maybe you?
So there are lots of systems around the world, and some of them perform better than the others. I'm just curious if you can personally see any bright spots. Say, okay, that country, that system does, in my opinion, remarkably well. Maybe the others could learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the Scandinavian systems do relatively well in terms of equality and support to students. Only they're very small. Parts of the US have a strong emphasis on equality and diversity work, which is why the whole Trump approach is so controversial. It's a big space over there. What the US, though, is that it's such a big system, and it's led by the states. It's federal. So what university looks like in New York, to California, but certain parts of that system do quite well, I would argue. Certain parts of other countries do well as well. I mean, are quite strongly supported. Even, for instance, universities in Peru and parts of Latin America that have a great emphasis on this area as well. Individual universities that are quite bright spots in terms of inequality and access. Even parts of the UK, we have some good examples of individual universities doing very well. And we actually had UK, Europe presented as well, Croatia, Romania, they've taken this quite seriously. Austria as well, take it quite seriously, and national strategies to take this in place. So our example of different parts of the agenda you have to look at. It's like your question, really. The way you phrased it, bright spots, is kind of a good way of thinking about it. You've also got like a kind of, a lot of darkness and bright spots emerge. So it's very interesting in the WAHEN work we did, where we put our advertising out, advertising our information out to lots of people. And it's surprising who would come forth. You would find examples. For instance, in Taiwan, I got a university in Taiwan come back to us who are really committed to this agenda. And I had no idea about the Taiwanese education. I know a bit about global education systems, not every country in the world. So bright spots come in countries, come in universities, they exist. I mean, that goes back to WAHEN as well. Connecting those spots together is a way we believe of trying to, scale up some form of change. They do exist.
Okay, so
On a high.
and let's finish on the bright spots. And thank you, Graeme, again for your talk. And he will still be around. So please take a cake and coffee and some drinks and discuss with us. Thank you.